formali.
Hai un posto preferito? Qua. Il tema.
Allora, qui sono, cioè, le faccio andare in loop costantemente.
Welcome to the 2023 edition of Trieste Next. I'm Luca, an AI-generated speaker who will be presenting our festival. In the next 3 days, we will be talking about a new world. This is the title of the 12th edition of our Festival of Science. Innovation and research, the ethical limits and new frontiers of science will be the center of all our events. What will the new world be like? Will we be able to face the challenges of the near future applying new scientific discoveries and technologies in a sustainable way? This will be the underlying theme of Trieste Next, with 100 events in English and Italian, the Science Book of the Year Literary Award, 300 speakers, 70 activities for schools and 40 exhibition spaces that are open for everybody in the city center close to the town hall. Before leaving the floor to our next panelists, I would like to thank all the scientific institutions within the Trieste City of Knowledge Network, the main partner together with our content partners and sponsors for supporting our project. Mostly, thank you to the 200 volunteers who are helping us. I have one last remark for all of you. The next event will last 75 minutes. Our speakers will answer all of your questions in the final 15 minutes. Also, please remember to check the updated schedule of events on our website. Thank you and enjoy our festival.
Good evening, everybody, and thanks for attending the second day of our Festival of Scientific Research. I will be very, very brief, but I would like to introduce our speakers tonight. Giulio Boccaletti, the Scientific Director for the Euro-Mediterranean Center for Climate Change. And then we have our guest of honor this year, Professor Andrea Rinaldo. Please, a round of applause. Andrea Rinaldo is a professor at the University of Padova and also at the Polytechnic University of Lausanne in Switzerland. And he's the only recipient so far, and a very recent recipient of the the Stockholm International Water Prize. That's the so-called Nobel Prize for Water. So we are very honored to have you as our guest tonight, and thanks for accepting our invitation. And thanks to Giulio for accepting our proposal to talk to him in the next 60 minutes. Thank you again, and welcome to Trieste Next.
Thank you. Right, can you hear me? Is this, yeah, good. Well, it's an incredible privilege and pleasure for me to be on stage with Andrea. Now, Antonio was quite brief in his introduction, so if you'll allow me, I'll just elaborate a little bit on Andrea's background, simply to level set everybody's expectation about what we're going to hear, because Andrea tends to be modest, but in fact, it's a remarkable career. I've worked in water for a number of years now, and I have to say that the breadth and depth of what Andrea has done over the course of many years is truly remarkable. He started out, and you'll correct me if I say anything that's wrong here, but he started out not his fault as an engineer, but he's really a scientist at heart, right? And started out in, as I did actually, in fluid mechanics and fluid dynamics, working on turbulence, but then partly because he became, I think, the youngest, or maybe either one of the youngest or the youngest full professor in hydrology in Italy, switched then to hydrology and devoted the rest of his life to hydrology, but in fact covered an enormous number of topics. I encountered Andrea's work when I was a graduate student at Princeton 25 years ago now, and he by then had already made a major contribution with another famous hydrologist, Ignacio Rodriguez Iturbe, on the fractal nature of rivers. That alone, and we'll talk a little bit about that, but that alone would have been enough to win the Stockholm Water Prize, which it did, because in fact Ignacio Iturbe did win the Stockholm Water Prize, which is sort of the Nobel Prize for water, if you're not aware of it. But then he went on to essentially create a whole new field, in some ways, applying those findings to very applied questions of biology, of the distribution of solutes, of pathogens in water, creating ecohydrology, essentially, a laboratory in ecohydrology. And we'll, I think, talk a lot about that as well. So this is a remarkable career of someone who's published over 300 papers and belongs to the academies of half the world. And so I'm really, for all these reasons, I'm quite excited about this conversation. But I thought we should start, and I'll come to you, by the way, so if you have questions, gather them up, because at the end, I'll turn to you and you can ask your questions of Andrea. But I thought I'd start with current events, and in truth, neither I nor Andrea are experts of Libya. But I think it is worth reminding ourselves that just a couple of weeks ago, we had a terrifying event in the southern Mediterranean. I'll just remind you very briefly, and then I'll turn to Andrea for some reflections. On the 5th or 6th of September, you remember it was cyclogenesis, a large storm formed over Greece, dumped an enormous amount of water on Thessaly. In fact, created a lake that wasn't there, because between 400 and 600 millimeters of water fell in a day. Then the storm moved across the Mediterranean, veered eastward and hit eastern Libya in Derna, a city at the bottom of the Wadi Derna. 2 dams collapsed, and we don't know yet how many, but at least 5,000 people were washed away in a matter of a few minutes. And the consequences of this, I think, we'll see evolving over time. So this is a major water event. As I said, data is actually quite scarce at the moment. Even if we were experts of Libya specifically, we wouldn't know much about what's gone on. People are still writing about it. But it does strike me that it's such a momentous event that it's worth at least a reflection. So you spent all your life thinking about water, you see this happening. What comes to mind? What is your reaction to an event like this?
Will you allow me to thank you for your generous introduction, and what you certainly have realized that this betrays the fact that I'm old. In fact, I'm the oldest serving professor in the University of Padua, EPFL, wherever I go, I'm the oldest guy. So it's just mirroring that simple fact. And yes, I had fun. I was an engineer. In fact, I've been somewhat curious about, for all my life, why certain prejudices affect the way the public perception about the role of the engineer, the heart of the engineer, the ruler that engineers used to have on their breast pocket that impedes the connection between the brain and the heart. This is Musil, there's a major writer known in these areas. So, so yeah, thanks so much for the general test. I'm very proud and happy, humbled and proud of having received this prize, recognizing one thing which I'm pleased to mention here, that is the scientific quality of a water community in this country. Not only we have the first chair of hydraulics ever, 1739 in Padua, L'Abate Poleni. So we started, it's the first chair ever in which explicitly mentioned hydraulics for water. Therefore, its importance, which in Venice, because of in Padua, because of a proximity to Venice, in fact, was perhaps obvious, the role and the fact that water sits squarely at the center of meta-history, or if you want, the history of history. And you can quote Bertrand Russell if you want, you can quote Winston Hugh Auden, the poet, if you want, see in that direction. So enough for the, introductory chat. But yes, Werner, it's something. It's a harsh reminder to us about what the fact that climate is changing very rapidly, and so should we. We should be able to change, and the idea that adaptation has very different facets, and of course, if you talk to hardcore scientists, you still, and many of the prominent climatologists with whom there is a dialogic relationship, would tell you almost inevitably that no, adaptation is just bullshit. No, what you have to figure out is mitigation, because you go to the core roots of a problem. Well, I have to say that I'm perhaps by bias, an engineering bias perhaps, and a great pessimism over the fact that we'll be able to converge on something meaningful. And that stems from my Global South fieldwork, which I've done for several years. It makes me think that the Global North is not credible with the Global South when we're talking about the capability of having any agreement. We are not credible. Talking about what happened in Libya, let me make a completely different parallel. And you know that 10 years ago, what is 11 years ago, in Caracas, you had something like 50,000 people dying. Why? Because of debris flow that happened on the wrong side of a hill over which Caracas is staying. And why? Because the pathway came from the different direction. It always come from a certain direction, and the perfect storm came from the other. We're not talking about Middle Ages, we're talking about 50,000 people, roughly estimated, in as much as you mentioned now that in Verna you have something like, how many? 5,000 or 6,000, but you really don't know what happened in there. Before I enter into the specific of that, because it's been something which we just started scratching the surface, in fact, of the issue in there. And it will take time, of course. Scientists are slow because we want to produce an opinion to the best of our knowledge, in fact. But let me quote another example, which about the perfect storm. Do you know that if you take the city of Trento, which I know very well, I've been a professor there for 7 years, when I became young enough to be able to decide about what to do in the morning when I was 30, was invaluable for if you're interested in curiosity-driven research. Well, in Trento, in 1966, you had that if you sum the discharge of the two major tributaries, the Adige as it is, and the last contributor, which pours into it maybe 10 kilometers upstream of the city of Trento, you would have like something like 3,500 cubic meters per second. I know this makes sense to you, but it's like, it's commonplace if you talk about a bar and you compare floods, etc. You single it out in a number. The pour discharge in the disastrous flood in 1951 is 12,500 cubic meters per second, something like that. These numbers are something which stick in the back of the mind of the engineers. Well, if you sum it in there, the peak of the two discharges, you would have something like 3,500 cubic meters per second. The actual maximum discharge that went through Trento and generated 6 meters of about a certain datum, that means that much of the old city was flooded, was about 2,000. Why? Because the pathway, in as much as it happened in Libya and what happened in Caracas, is typically one in which the path is a path in which you essentially have it south-north. That is, you start mobilizing the catchments from the south, because it's typical perturbation that comes from south, and it mobilizes first the contributing parts of a catchment down there, and later on the farthest away that you have. Well, assume you're going to have the same intensity but reversed, taking the other path, mobilizing first the catchments up in Merano or in the Pusteria Valley down there, in such a way that with the same amount of water that we have seen in the past be mobilized at different times, you would have 3,000 to 4,000 cubic meters per second. In Trento, we have thousands of casualties now. The message is we have to be ready, because in the face of climatic change, the different patterns, the vagaries of nature, this is something that could happen, in fact. And that's something which I keep telling my students that the driest place on Earth is a certain part of a Sahel desert in which you haven't had a drop of water for the past 35 years. Not a drop of water for 35 years. Well, take a remotely acquired picture of it, and you will see the traces of teeming rivers that pass through the thing. The good fortunes don't last forever. And the mark of climatic change, very rapid climatic change, is in fact the heterogeneity of the patterns. What happened in Libya is scary. not completely unexpected, because I think that somebody dug out some papers written in Arabic language in which it was obvious that the kind of infrastructure that was built at the time was inadequate and prone to disaster as it happened. But in that I want to just to mention one thing, and probably I talk too much. I tend to do that, actually, as you know, because I kind of like this stuff. But and it relates to Libya. When Gaddafi launched the big exploitation, the big underground tapping of fossil water in below the Atlas Mountains in Libya, it's water that's been standing there for like 30,000 years. And Gaddafi made one of those deep underground things to tap it and to produce it, and to produce the water for developing whatever his view was, but certainly the intent was to prompt economic development, social and economic development in Libya. So at a certain point, it was well known that a journalist asked him, "Sir, what do you think? What you're doing now is not sustainable." "Excuse me," the guy said. "It's not sustainable. Can you explain it to me?" Gaddafi said to the interviewer. And it means that this water cannot be recharged now. Once you take it out, it won't be replaced. But see, who got it there? I said, Gaddafi literally couldn't understand what was the concept of sustainability. And when finally understood, you mean that we just using it and maybe finish that? Well, this is inshallah. It's the good Lord that sent it. He will send it back. So the message is, if you're talking about issues of this kind, you have to face what a geographer and of great value, Lucio Gambi in Italy, called the invisible structures, the traditions of a place, the juridic organization, the political organization, it's something you have to face whenever you have to exploit these things. And in the case of Libya, in fact, what happened is devastating, is terrifying, to be seen again soon in many a place, where it's not easy to say, but this will happen because of a physical law. And the physical law says that the culprit is the fever of the planet, as Lovelock used to call it, is the temperature, the increase of temperature. For every single degree of temperature more of the air, it means that an inescapable law, it's called Clapeyron's law, says that you're going to have from 6 to 7% more water vapor that atmosphere will hold. And what does it mean? What the hell do you want that it happens? When you face a cold front, you're going to have stronger rains, you're going to have water bombs, that's what you're expecting there. With a bias, of course, because it's only certain scales that are affected. But we're going to have more Libyas, we're going to have more Caracas, we're going to have Trento probably in that condition, and so we have to prepare.
Yeah, and I want to extract a couple of things from what you said, but no. We have plenty of time. Because of course, you know, the story of Libya, you're absolutely right. A lot of it has to do with failure, not just of infrastructure, but of institutions, right? And Gaddafi built a state that's now collapsed, and Haftar controls that area, and the great man-made river is a great example of the hubris of managing water that way. But I'm struck, and I think everybody will be struck by the variety of examples that you brought to bear in this conversation, from Caracas to Libya, to Trento. And I suppose a theme of your work, certainly of your early work, was to look for universality in some of these structures, right? Some of this organization. I think it's worth putting a pin on it, because it was, you know, the stories you just told are the symptom of a mind that's looking for patterns. And in a way, a lot of certainly your early work and your work with Iturbe was about that, was it not?
It is a beautiful question, actually, Giulio. And yes, I'm interested in patterns. I'm interested in patterns in nature. I'm interested in how nature works. And it became apparent, in fact, in the early 90s, I would say, that there was something special, in fact, in the water field, in hydrology and in geomorphology, that is, in that infancy, there was at the time the capability of remotely acquiring and objectively manipulating images that could be taken remotely. Remote sensing was becoming, I remember the excitement that we had when we extracted the first, in fact, digital terrain map. Something which, by the trick, you see, Professor Caldarelli is there. He was a PhD student in CISA, and he started, and I heard his talk, a beautiful talk before, and he remembers that very clearly. And in fact, it was a catchment, Riofella, next to the close by, about 50 kilometers from there, with tricks like making the size, when you have a computer pen writing it, a trick in which you make it thicker as it starts aggregating. And so what hydrology had at that point was something which you don't even have say, space science, for instance. That is 6 to 7 clean orders of magnitude. You can observe a process which has the same dominant phenomenon. I'm talking about the fluvially dominated, the fluvial transport dominated parts of a landscape. In some cases, you can arrive to 10,000 kilometers. From a scale of maybe a meter today, now by filtering vegetation, you go to 10 centimeters. Something whose ground truthing you can do with much ease. You can walk through the place and see it. So all of a sudden, hydrology was brought into a bigger game than it had always been. And especially centered here in Trieste, we started talking about and discussing about self-organization, critical self-organization. We had Perbach and Mandelbrot coming here, in fact, centered in Trieste, with Ignacio Rodriguez and myself. I said, what is the key issue? How can you explain it to me? The fact is clear, as it was shown by Benoit Mandelbrot, is that for 3,000 years, we have looked at the geometry of nature with wrong eyes. Mountains are not cones. Clouds are not spheres. Coastline are not simple broken line, nor does lightning travel in straight lines. It's the geometry of nature that speaks a language, a mathematical language, which remained unknown for about 3,000 years. And what happens, the reflex of that, when the simple observation, as important as it is, and my hat off to Mandelbrot, no matter what mathematicians say, probably he recycled mathematics that was there since the 19th century. Who cares? It's fantastic. Without him, we wouldn't be talking about this for I don't know how many years that you had in the place. But the fact is, if I take a map of a river and I show it to you, and I take out the scale bar, you cannot tell me whether this is the Amazon or the Fella River or any kind of, well, of course, geomorphology would have exceptions. If you're in the deltaic region, you will see loops, for instance, which you don't see, but I'm simplifying. But essentially, you cannot tell whether the system is large or small. And the systems in which the shape is the same is a system which has an infinite number of degrees of freedom, can do completely different things, different climates, different vegetation, different geology, you name it, whatever it is. And we do the same thing. These are the self-organized critical systems, meaning the system without any tooling of Mother Nature, without a kind of a screwdriver or a magic or divine screwdriver that adjusts parameters, etc., does always the same thing. It's inevitable. It's the creation without God, as Telmo Piovani said beautifully well about the biological evolution. And this means universality, and I am interested in the universal patterns. When I see at the disaster, as you so kindly mentioned, that if you're talking about what happened in Verna, what happened in many other places, floods, still floods are the largest cause of accidental deaths in the world as we speak. And okay, I could easily divert into other things, etc. Of course, how do you compute that? It's a complicated fact, and it could be misleading because you have to make it proportional to the population in a sense. But the key point is that the universality that you see in the form of a river networks over such a large amount of scales. And of course, I'm not claiming that this exhausts anything else, but it's an important part of biodiversity, it's an important part of biological invasions, it's a very important ingredient of the propagation of waterborne and water-based disease. That universality oozes into the function of river networks. So the discovery of the universality of river networks was very exciting, and finding out tweaking certain parts and seeing why, for instance, certain kinds of feasible optimality kicks into the place was very exciting. But what even more exciting in my view, and what kindly was attributed to my lab in particular, was the fact that that kind of universal characters and and inevitability, if you want, transfers to the processes that occur on river networks. Thus, we have a clue on how to evaluate quantitatively the so-called natural capital.
And we'll get to the applications of the subsequent applications of your findings, but I want to just stay on the morphology and on the dynamics of the rivers for a second. Because I'm struck by two things in your work, and I wonder if you can reflect on its implications for our current situation. So on the one hand, your work is extraordinarily rigorous, and I think mathematically rigorous even, right? I mean, in the end, you've described it narratively, but in the end, this is a statement about the topology of these structures, and so it's quite sophisticated. At the same time, in all the writing I've read of you, you always point out the difficulty of working with enormous uncertainty. Knowing what the river does at any given time is a complicated thing to know. Measurements are scarce, even today, the most technological age we've ever lived in. It's still quite hard to know in that particular day what's going to happen. So, you've studied these systems for a long time. I want to bring us back to the present, because we talked about Derna, we talked about Caracas, etc. We are in Italy. We also had this last 2 years of extraordinary events, a very long drought that, occupied a year and a half. And then these massive floods in Romagna. Is there, you look at these events with kind of that background, with that deep scientific and deep rigorous background. Is there a connection between the work that you did at the time and these very applied and kind of real problems, recognizing there's a lot of infrastructure in the middle, right? But what does that science tell us, if anything, about our predicament?
Well, looming in the background, there's always this engineer's heart. That is, you have to figure out something that could be done for the betterment of society, if you want, the welfare or whatever you want to call it. So yes, there was always in there, what is this for? Of course, the interest and the fascination of the process has to be measured against something tangible. And let me make another example. The vagaries of my reflections are well, you have to get used to that because we're becoming friends now. But when you so kindly put this book, which in fact I published something like 15 years ago, whatever, it's been republished with the big bang of a Stockholm Water Prize. But in there, I was writing? I wrote the introduction to the second edition in late April, maybe. And what I was saying is that, okay, now we're talking about droughts. Droughts are very important. That's well, we have leading expert here. And tonight, in fact, we'll be listening to Giulio presenting his book on droughts, in fact, which is super interesting. And but in the introduction, I was writing April 2023. Now, everybody talked about droughts. Would you bet with me, I wrote, that next year we'll be talking about floods? I was wrong, and I made a correction in introduction. It took 2 weeks to shift from one mode to the other. And that's exactly the point. It's the rapidity of a change. Don't buy those bullshit from merchants of doubts that climate change or climatic changes have always been in there. Of course it's true. It's the rapidity of a change, which is something we have to keep in mind. If you look at what happened in some of the pictures, if we will turning into that, we'll see that a huge number of examples of what's called hockey stick diagrams. That is, what you have, since we started measuring something, any social or economic measurements, population, worldwide, GDP, or consumer fertilizers, or temperature of the sea temperatures, or you're talking about concentration of CO2, concentration of methane, you name it. And you see that is one of the pictures. No, that's a different one. The next one, I think it's the one you'll be seeing, and this will be turning on. Everything that we have done since we started measuring somewhat sensibly, but is early 18th century, I said. But Padua again, Galileo started, in fact, putting on the measurements, the first measurements on his observatory, and Polleni, in fact, started in 1710 the daily time series of daily precipitation, which is the easiest one, in which you have essentially like one known surface of a bucket, and every 9 a.m. of every morning since 1710, we've been collecting those data, one of the longest time series. But whatever measure you take, all of them fall in some Holocene-like flat curve that remains from 1710 to 1810 to 1910. Everything's flat, 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 whatever measure you say. There should be probably the next, if you, I can do that probably. I can probably do that, and probably the next one. Oh, no, that works. Oh, but it doesn't matter. I can give you the reference if I get
I think they'll try and,
they'll try, yeah, sure enough. But anyways, but what happens is that it's a hockey stick diagram, flat and then going up. And when did all they start? In the 1950, more or less, a year more, a year less. And the acceleration is boundless. It's the rapidity of the change what should scare us. And that's the most important feature that we have to keep in mind.
So obviously, you know, we are living in a rich country. Most developed countries built an enormous amount of infrastructure and defenses over the course of the 20th century to ignore the effects of that hockey stick until very recently. So we sort of like Wile E. Coyote, we went over the edge quite some distance before we started realizing that something was wrong. But as you mentioned at the beginning, as you describe also in the book, your passion is also with the global south, with the problem of those who have always been vulnerable, who've never actually, oh, there it is. We'll come back to this, but who've always been vulnerable, who are vulnerable. For example, I worked in Ethiopia for many years, and you know, this is a country of 100 million people with 100 million hectares, with a GDP at the time of maybe 20 billion. So you're talking about $200 per capita per year. These are, and you know, for them, the US, for example, has about 4,000 cubic meters of storage per capita. That means that you can switch off the tap for 3 years and you still have water. Ethiopia at the time had 40 cubic meters of storage per capita. That means you switch off the tap for 2 weeks and you're done, right? You're completely exposed. And so for them, infrastructure and the development of water resources and the management of water resources was existential, right? It's about development. It's about the transformation of the landscape to support growth. And so you develop this theory, this powerful lens, and then you start looking for applications, and you turn to the so-called South. You turn to the most vulnerable. How did that happen?
Well, it happened in a walk, in fact, in the Vatican. There was a meeting of Pontifical Academy of Sciences. Ignacio Rodriguez was a distinguished member of the Academy, and it was with Marino Gatto, a great, in fact, theoretical ecologist in Polytechnical Milan, and Ignacio and I, just by walking back on this magic place, we immediately realized, totally serendipitously, serendipity at its best, that what we had been done in studying biodiversity and river networks was exactly the same math that you would have if you wanted to understand how spatially explicit models of disease propagation would work, one-on-one, immediately. And so we started like making up those in fact, a physicist I knew, it was a fascinating one, used to say that models are fun and sometimes even instructive. And we found instructive, in fact, something which came out of that, because in fact, when he was studying, for instance, by the way, the first divergence as always, the first model of cholera, a disease I studied, epidemic cholera, was done by Capasso and Paveri Fontana, and is Italian. It was done with respect to data collected in Bari, but not in the Middle Ages, in the 70s. You know that. And but the idea is that even if you look at any kind of epidemics, airborne, waterborne, or whatever, you say, okay, what is the rate of change of new infections in Italy? Well, in Bolzano or in Sicily, you may have completely different patterns. The idea is that precisely because we know that the key engine for propagation of disease, whether waterborne or airborne, of course, I concentrate on the ecological cycles of the pathogens waterborne because that's what I do for a living. But in reality, what you know is that mobility now, and on this I'll make a statement in a minute, can be measured. Big data indeed. Everybody has a cell phone. We can track cell phones. We know where everybody, at least in Italy, goes. And that where the people go, in fact, if you look at COVID, for instance, which is an airborne disease on which, in fact, we worked in as much, as it happened for those big high fashion industries that started making masks at a certain point during the pandemic to do something, entire lines of production dedicated to personal protections. So we started because we were stranded at home, we worked on the early data that were communicated about the COVID spread. And what you will see about how it started, in the famous places next to Pavia or in Veneto, etc., and started propagating along the highways, La Via Salaria, where the hell you were. It's the people that carry it. And that gets me to that global south perspective, because what happens is that, of course, we started then studying cholera. We published the first spatial explicit means with people moving and human settlements where they are with their population, also known worldwide, by the way, because we live in a very connected and informatics savvy society, so data can arrive from any part of the world very quickly. And when in 2010, Haiti, the poorest country in the world, was struck by an earthquake that killed 300,000 people and destroyed whatever infrastructure was left in the city. And in October 2010, an outbreak of cholera struck Haiti. Now, what is interesting and sad is the fact that Haiti had been cholera-free for about 200 years. So it was legitimate to assume that the entire population was naive, that is, not having any prior immunity to count on. Well, the sad story, which is another thing, talking about our credibility, is that we planted the disease. It was healthy, as asymptomatic carriers from the UN peacekeeping troops from Nepal when it was sequenced. And it was clearly, but we planted it and it started propagating a speed light. So I ran there. Terre des Hommes, an NGO based in Lausanne, helped me, and I went there 3 times. I had this, the Swiss are not particularly flexible, as you would imagine, but still I got permission to skip teaching and to delay teaching to be there in the hotspot of the thing. And what happened? I realized that in the market of Carrefour, in the outskirts of Port-au-Prince, at the peak of infection, the picture should be someplace, well, probably too far down the road in here, well, whatever. Just I put a nice picture, and because it was meant it wasn't meant to be a thing like an organizer structure. But let me tell you this, because this is significant in my view. And I saw with my eyes in Carrefour a young lady with there's a picture in there which I took. It's probably, keep going. Yes. It's down the road, because I thought I would speak about it much later. Anyways, this, she will come. Here's Haiti. That's the data. Go. Perfect. Here she comes. And I was, in fact, besides I love to take pictures, but in that case I was in an armored car, because they can kill you to steal your camera. Poorest country in the world. There's no police. There's no water supply network. There's no sewer system. There's no road in that place. And I saw in my eyes that red lady showing the app on her Nokia 1900. They're getting a cabbage from that lady on the right in return. That's something amazing. Because what happens is that ownership of a cell phone in Haiti is not socially biased, but the access to safe water is. And who did that? It's us. Because the infrastructure needed to generate the need of that and propagating like pushers of drug is us. We cannot turn the head of the other. So my perspective and my pessimism on the capability of having any kind of possible mitigation agreement between the global south and the global north, that is now commonly accepted, the chance, in my view, having been in the south of the world a lot, is 0 in my view.
When I was in southern Oromia, in the southern part of Ethiopia, I went to a village that, looked like it could have been 1200, 200 AD. But there were 2 things that told me we were in the modern world. In the middle of the village, there was a crate of Coca-Cola, and I had 4 bars on my cell phone connection, right? Everything else was non-modern except those 2 things. So I think there's something really profound about this problem. And meanwhile, these people have to walk 4 or 5 hours to find water, right? And we talked about the development of a theory, a pretty rigorous theory, that then gets applied to these very very kind of human problems, right, and developmental issues. Incidentally, you skipped over this, but you had some pictures there. This is the same exact technology that you use to describe also invasive species, right? So the universality is really remarkable. In the book here, you spend a fair amount of time expanding from these questions of pathogen travels and ecological systems to the role of nature and water, right? And so I wanted to get your reflections on this, because often these days we talk about adaptation and climate in the same breath we then start talking about nature. And I detected in your book a sort of a tension in the relationship with how we think about the environment today. I'm reminded, just to kind of frame the question, you know, I worked a fair amount in China where they built Three Gorges Dam, right? The Three Gorges Dam was a huge piece of infrastructure, 600 kilometers of impoundment. It's 28 million tons of concrete that holds back the Yangtze. And then when they built it, they lost all the ecosystems because they turned the river into a canal. And one of the things they lost was the Yangtze sturgeon, which turned out to be a very precious cultural resource. And so then I spent several years, my team spent several years trying to help Three Gorges Dam reoperate the dam to simulate the pulses of water that would come down the river with the monsoon, so that they could simulate the spawning signals for the sturgeon. And this is kind of a theme, right? We're wrestling with this problem. We engineer the landscape and our rivers to support development. Certainly in Haiti and in Ethiopia, there's other places, they need access to water. That means they need infrastructure. But then at the same time, we don't want to deteriorate the ecology. We want to we want to preserve nature. We say today that we want to be nature positive even, right? And so there's this tension between developmental objectives and the preservation of nature in some sense. And you speak a fair amount about this in your book. What are your thoughts about that tension?
It's a beautiful subject, and we may elaborate on that for a long time, not now, but the two ovens, or the two hats, if you want. Of course, science is about the study of how nature works. Engineering, as was famously said, is the study of something of what is not yet, in a sense. So these two tensions are always in the back of our mind when you're talking about, in fact, training the waters. Now, I could chat forever and quote millions of quotes about how this universality of shapes transforms into universality of processes that occur on those networks. This kind of robustness is the key, in my view, why environmental economics. One of the key points at a big discussion in economics now is development thinking against environmental thinking, hinging on the fact that it's very clear nowadays that wealth indicators that do not entail, because they do not put a value on the natural capital, are misleading at best in representing the wealth of the poverty of nations. And what is interesting, in fact, and one of the things that I may show you right now, which it's even a movie, this one in Haiti. Oh no, the movies don't work, I'm sorry. Sorry, I should have thought that. And, when I was showing you the total cumulative cases of cholera in Haiti in the first about 11 months or it lasted for 10 years, in fact. It became endemic and it never went away. And what you see in there is the total number of cumulative cases is a map of the rivers. So rivers have a template for how, in fact, disease propagates. There's no doubt, and something which is remarkable per se and gives you great predictive abilities. But for instance, biological invasions or difficult decisions that we had to take in the past. I'm sorry if it's totally, because it wasn't meant to be organized in that way. I think it's here, yeah. But no. Or here, whatever. These are the places. This picture is quite revealing, in fact. I took it in Liulgu, in the sub-Saharan Africa, in Burkina Faso, where we started study for a long time a debilitating disease, in fact, bilharziosis or schistosomiasis, because it was also
river blindness, right?
It's again something which in which part we call about the waterborne disease is the one in which a major part of an intermediate host for the thing that has to do with water, in fact. And what is interesting, in fact, is a typical and living example of why determining the true wealth and poverty of nations is not easy. What Burkina Faso did at the time of Compaoré, and then I will link to the Libyan, he was a dictator, but he was a stable guy. And when he fell, in fact, it was some sort of a revolution, fueled, in fact, by jihadists. He sent the country into havoc. Now it's a disaster. We had to leave everything we had done for like 50 years. The PFL worked in Burkina Faso for like 50 years, and now it's completely gone, completely destabilized. That was the goal of the jihadists, in fact. But what happened is that Compaoré, connecting to what, the idea that in the Three Gorges Dam, or in the Oriental despotism, as a sociologist called it, said famously that the degree of freedom in a country is inversely proportional to the length of its rivers. And the idea of the true cost of a dam, especially a large dam, never shows up on a balance sheet, started developing. If you look at the investments the World Bank had on big dams, was growing up at the beginning of the 20th century, and then now is going to zero, because it's fraught with so many issues, environmental, then the actual cost, etc. There's been literature on that. But so fast enough, the dictator of Burkina Faso, dictator, the strongman of Burkina Faso, got financing for 15,000 small dams. In fact, this is one of those. And it means because of a particular hydrologic regime, it rains a hell of a lot in a very concentrated amount of time. So the idea is just to prompt an agriculture in which you channelize essentially those into irrigation canals, and you expand enormously your capability to produce primary production, food in rain-fed agriculture. Now, what happens is the following, that you've seen immediately in Burkina Faso the increase in the GDP induced by improved agriculture. But you haven't placed the cost of waterborne disease, the debilitating disease, and poverty-reinforcing disease like schistosomiasis or billet sores that was induced by the enormous expansion of the habitat of intermediate host for that, which is a particular type of freshwater snail, actually. Now, this is interesting because you say, okay, but how can we measure that? Well, we couldn't. But the idea that measuring only things by GDP, as Partha Dasgupta famously said, is not giving you the true picture of the wealth of that nation, because you have to put the cost properly into that. And the cost induced the poverty-reinforcing, the contribution of the poverty-reinforcing and cognitive impairing disease that you have. Well, rivers allow you to predict that reasonably now, and it's written in the shape and the extent of a habit, of a fluvial habitat that you have. So in a sense, we are inching towards a better way of assessing costs and benefits, which in reality, and that's a scientist speaking, of course, not the engineer, we shouldn't decide that certain things should be done at all costs. But we have truly, I mean, without any prejudice, we have to look at the true costs and benefits that include the natural capital in the game.
And that's a key to a lot of your writing when you talk about applied things, right? It's not, you're not suggesting that naively nature's the answer. You're not suggesting that, complete build-out of infrastructure as we did 100 years ago is the answer. What you're saying is that the science that we have today is capable of giving us a more informed view as to what the true costs and benefits are. And so this gets us to the heart, I suppose, of the decision-making process that leads you to then make choices, right? Do we invest in nature-based solutions, as they're called today? And your book's called Il Governo dell'Acqua, Governing Water. And so in the end, this is a story, you cited Carl Wittfogel, the sociologist, and really, in the end, this goes back to the relationship between citizens, the state, and the landscape. Who gets to decide how we manage our resources, right? And what is the legitimate, informed but legitimate choice that we have to make. Now, you look around, you see what's happening here, you see what's happening in many developing countries where you've worked. Are you optimistic that we have the state institutions and the political institutions that are capable of making those informed decisions, or what would we need to do to get closer to those informed institutions?
Well, it's a difficult question to answer, but certainly my take is that what I would advise governments on is just to maybe make mistakes, but siding on science part, because science has the ability of correcting itself continuously. And the idea, of course, it's not the hubris of a scientist, of course. We know how limited and imperfect our knowledge is, of course, because we are scientists. When they ask me, I mean, you're superstitious. They tell me, all the sportsmen are all superstitious. Aren't you a scientist? Exactly. I know how little we know. So I am superstitious. Yes, I am. And so the idea is that the advice I could tell is that, and in certain countries it happens, Sweden, for instance, the reputation of science and the way it advises governments is so high. In fact, I'm really amazed at that. The idea is that, of course, we make mistakes. We will always make mistakes. Mistakes in the evaluation of costs and benefits of what we be seeing around us. And by the way, don't buy for a second la sapienza dei secoli, what people knew since ever, the syndrome, the Laureate syndrome is so-called. And Gore Vidal, well, it's a different story. No, I want to divert. Anyways, our predecessors knew nothing about nature, truly. What we live in a society that never, ever knew so much, actually. We'll make mistakes, of course we will, but it's always fair and safe to make mistakes on science side, on what currently general wisdom given by science tells you, because science completely regenerates itself continuously. So there's no alternative, I think.
And sorry, I have to go there. I didn't know if I had time, but in your book you talk a lot about Venice and the Venice Lagoon. Of course, you have enormous connections to the city. You are from Venice. You were there when the 1966 flood happened, and you've been witnessed and partly participant to the conversations about the transformation of the lagoon and its protection, right? And so,
sorry, I realized I was going in the wrong direction.
Sorry. And so I think the experience of Venice and the building of the Mose and the transformation of the lagoon, all of this kind of is an embodiment of this question, right? Of how you use science and engineering and knowledge to actually make informed decisions. How was the experience of engaging with that, 60-year-long process of saving the lagoon?
Yes, you're touching my heart, you know that, and Venice is a very important part of me. I was born and raised in Venice. I moved to Padua when I was 30, but all my schooling was in there, etc. I certainly was in town in 1966 when the major flood that hit most of Italy, in fact, in that case generated like a storm surge in the Adriatic that generated like almost 2 meters of water. In town, 100% of the city was completely flooded, and I was there. So in fact, it exceeded the level in which you started. There was no electricity, there was no power of any kind, there was no heating of any kind. It was November, and when the waters finally receded, the misery was such that everybody was wondering, okay, will Venice survive? In fact, it's a fragile system that. When naturally lagoons are transgressions and regressions of a sea level, in fact, generated situations in which these are unstable conditions. And what you're seeing here, in fact, in this picture, this is a Palazzo Franchetti, and there's a trick in there. You see, the photographer put upside down the picture, in fact, because the actual that's the reflected in water part, the one you see on the top, and not the one outside the water. It was taken during the lockdown, in fact, and I had to go there because it's a learning institution that owns it. I'm the administrator of that, so I wanted to check if everything was going okay and was nothing, dying, etc. And there are two things that are important for a general lesson that comes from there. First, the key word is rapidity. Rapidity is quickness of things to happen. Why? Because pandemic, in fact, Venice knows exactly what is the Black Plague, in fact, in the 15th century and the 16th century, in fact. But in that case, pandemics would take 10 to 20 to 30 years to becoming such. Now, it took only one flight from Wuhan to Toronto to generate pandemics, one day. not 30 years. So it's a pace of change that scares. And the good news instead is something that during those days, what I have seen with my eyes in that channel that separates Palazzo Franchetti from Palazzo Barbaro, which was, where Isabella Gardner established in the 19th century her wonderful place in which you had Henry James, in which you had Sargent. It was a vibrant place. There's a small channel, a small canal connecting the two. And opening the window and seeing what happened, I saw with my eye an octopus in there. Now, quickness. Nature easily and rapidly regains its proper. Because what happens is that, I mean, the octopus is infinitely, I'm exaggerating, of course, but it's very sensitive to the cleanness of water. The habitat needs to have still waters, and you have to have, and within 2 months of lockdown, when the octopus got back into that situation, and that brings me to my true concern. I talked about the hockey stick diagram and the preoccupation that we have, and what I'm saying is that the IPCC report, the latest one, the regional studies are 2023. The last one was in 2022, and I spoke to some of the science representative, Thomas Stalker, who's from Bern, who's a very good friend of mine, in fact. And what you have seen is that is shown in these two diagrams. On the left is that the projections of sea level rise in a number of RCP, reference concentration pathways, that you have, in which essentially what the IPCC is suggesting that we have been narrowing down the uncertainty to a level in which, give and take, the message is within 100 years, we're going to have at least 1 meter more or relative sea level. And I won't build them a fact why it's a meter, whereas it says 70 centimeters, because you have to add subsidence of a platform over which Venice sits and the likes. And why that connects to what you were saying is that it took us 60 years to converge on, I mean, people wouldn't talk to me because I said the obvious in the past, that is, if the problem of Venice in 1966 onwards was a protection against exceptionally high tides, there was no alternative to the interruption of exchange between the sea and the lagoon for obvious hydrodynamic reasons. And it took us 60 years from the starting thinking about the thing to put it into operation. We cannot wait 60 years, because if you allow the system to work as it is now, and by the way, that means that different colors means that so-called a certain rarity of the event is changing and changing fast, which is an issue technical. We could discuss about that a lot. It's called metastatistics, something in which the distribution over which you draw to finding out the probability of a rare event changes under your feet. And rapidity is again the key word, because it's changing fast. Is a distribution stationary? Give me a break. But what is interesting is that this diagram was totally upsetting me, because that shows the Mose. And what is the Mose doing, assuming that it will be operating in about 100 years? The safety factors adopted means that against exceptionally high tides would work still in about 100 years. But you have to close the barriers 260 days a year if you want to with the current operating rules. 260 days a year means what? First, you're not going to have a lagoon. It's going to be a filthy pond. Second, you're not going to have any maritime activity possible, because no company, in any case, I mean, the good fortune of Trieste was essentially the big ships diverted to here from the fact that they wouldn't be passing in town. And but I mean, for 1,000 years, the greatness of Venice was built, and the absolute unmovable law that would preserve the lagoon was precisely because it was foster navigation and help defense, by the way. So you wouldn't have a port, which is something in which the welfare of a city based for 1,000 years. You won't have a lagoon. You're going to have a filthy pond, of course. In the context in which you have 50,000 residents and 32 million visitors a year, what do you expect to remain of a city? Then you say, okay, you want to close probably because it's becoming a thematic park, and I fear for the very structure of the city. The city will collapse, will piece by piece, will be melting and rotting. And it's intergenerational, because I won't be there for sure, but not even my kids, and probably not even my grandchildren, talk about 100 years from now. The moment to start rethinking radically Venice as a template on how to adapt to climate change is now, because 60 years go by in a blinking of the eye, and we cannot wait. It will be too late if we don't move. The moment to act is now.
So we're getting to the end of this conversation, and I want to go to the audience, but I have one last question. So if you have questions, prepare yourselves to ask them. You know, we sort of, in this conversation, we went through a lot of the milestones of your career, and you know, you have been and have always been a true scientist, in the sense that you've allowed curiosity and ignorance, in a way, to guide your search. But your last remark suggests that you now believe science has a civic duty. And I suspect there are a number of, and you like me, right? I mean, I'm a scientist by training, but I ended up, and I think that we are at a particular junction in time, in some ways, where maybe curiosity-driven science is not the only thing we need to be involved in. And here you might have a few younger scientists from the schools around the area. So what's your, and by the way, if you guys buy and read the book, which I strongly suggest you do, you'll see that it's as much a humanist book as it is a scientific book, right? Because there's a real engagement with the human condition. And so what do you think is the role of a scientist today, or how different is it from when you started out, when you decided, you know, 30-year-old Andrea decided to become a hydrologist? How is it different today?
Probably because the Venetian upbringing has a lot to do, because the fact that you live in such an intrinsically unstable environment, you have the idea that you have to participate in the discussions about, as it happened for 1,000 years in Venice. So I believe that the role of a scientist is a militant role. We cannot simply turn our head on and pretend that we don't see what the things that we can, in fact, help sort out on the science side. So yes, I am militant, I'm afraid, and very much like you, Giulio. And time to act, in the case of Venice, is now. And I really would like to have, in a sense, the Venice case as a template on what we should not see happening in the future, for future generations. And that will be the legacy, in fact. And I won't stop, and I will be vocal about it. You can bet on that.
Good. Well, thank you, Andrea, for the conversation. Let's give a round of applause to Andrea. Thank you. Right, so we have a few minutes left. So are there questions? I see one in front here, and then one there, and then one there.
Good evening. I have a question about an experience that I had recently. I'm a biology student at the University of Milano Bicocca. Recently, I've gone to the Maldives to participate to an applied ecology workshop there, in Magudu specifically, which is right below the equator in a way. And aside from explaining to us all the ecology around that, because of course we're biologists, we do that, but they explained to us a bit of the political climate in the Maldives, which I want to, point out that the Maldives have one of the most complicated ecosystems and most important ecosystems, which is the coral reef around, which is very important to the whole world, not just the Maldives. And also, they are right on sea level. Like, if the sea level rises 2 centimeters from what it is now, they're flooded. They basically will not be able to live there anymore. But what they've been doing, especially with the last elections that happened there, is they're trying to enforce politics which, in theory, should make the economy of the country better, because they would enforce tourism. So they basically trying to build new resorts, trying to build new airports, doing land reclamations to basically turn pieces of sea into airports, into ground surfaces that they can build stuff on. But this is also against the interest. Like, they will be getting tourists because they build the infrastructure for that, but tourists come there to see the nature that they have. Like, we go there to see the reef, basically. And specifically in the island where I was, we have a research center there, of course, which is where we go to do our internships and stuff. On those islands, they're doing currently a land reclamation where they're turning a piece of sea into land which they want to build an airport on. And the island council, the question is, what can you do when you, as a scientific community especially, when you're talking to nations who are at the same time going for the interest because they're trying to make the tourism better, but at the same time against it, and they don't really have a clue on what it's right to do. Like, how do you solve such a situation?
So again, the tension between development and nature. Let me suggest we collect 3 questions and then you can answer all of them, otherwise we might not have time. So one there and then one at the next one.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the talk, and I wanted to ask you, because you mentioned Ethiopia, and I wanted to ask you actually about the dam being built on the Nile that is creating the tension between the countries, between Egypt and Ethiopia. And I would like to ask you if there is any chance of a compromise between the countries, because like it's a hard question.
Very good. And then I think we had a question there, and then after that.
Hello, thank you for the talk. I would have a question about fractals, and if you could give us some more examples, perhaps, of where you encountered fractals, and even about the mathematics, if you could go into it.
All of it in 5 minutes. So, so let's take these 3, and then let's see if we have more.
Okay,
more
first, in fact, thank you for your question. And what reminds me that I haven't specified something which I should have, in fact, specified. That is, Venice is not the example of any possible adaptation to climatic change and sea level rise, but it's a template of adaptation to sea level rise when the built environment cannot be relocated, which is the important thing. Now, the importance of the reefs can hardly be overestimated. Of course, the whole journey of the atmosphere started in reefs, so just we won't even spend a minute of that. But on that issue, and I would very much suggest a reading, in fact, which is very, very powerful and very respected, the work of Jared Diamond. And the work of Jared Diamond in 2 books in particular called Guns, Germs, and Steel, and which even won the Pulitzer Prize, by the way, I happen to know him. And the second one is Collapse, because he was exactly making a parallel between how, in fact, the convergence of environmental issues and the capital, they should agree more than is commonly thought, that more of the narratives are independent narratives suggest. And those pages are very, very beautiful pages. And if you remind me briefly, Niles, well, whatever. We screwed up a system that for 3,000 years has been the cradle of civilization. So basically, the high Aswan Dam changed for good, and the retreat of the deltaic area of the Nile, it's a disaster. Mind you, 3,000 years ago, the taxes were paid by such was the regularity of the flooding generated by the Nile River, because its vital role, etc. The taxes were paid by the level actually reached by the waters in the years, etc. It's been a shame. And if you look even in Italy, for instance, if you look at a certain part of the literature, the futurist literature, in fact, applauding the Aswan Dam, the highest achievements, etc., the relocations that they generated, in fact. But it was the spirit of the times, the invisible structures. So the feeling that generated the thing, and especially the English started it, and then actually it became, in fact, the high Aswan Dam was done afterwards, with the British rule was no longer there. All I'm saying is that what we should have learned should be to use a fair, impartial cost and benefit analysis. That's what economics left us to discuss, and to use science as much as possible. I may just quote that I see some signs that Dalai Lama said something which was heartening to me, but he says that, when I find that deeply held beliefs that are in the Buddhist religion are now shown wrong by science, I side with science. We made mistakes for hundreds of years. And I think from a religious person, I think that's a very, very healthy attitude. So, so that's the issue. So it's not going to be easy, but cost and benefits impartially and neutrally evaluated with the science on your side is the only way out. The only way out, in my view. Fractals, it's well interesting, and I don't know if you by chance if you read the Fractal Geometry of Nature, the book of Mandelbrot, is incomprehensible. Let's face it, it's a very complicated book. But some part of our narrative stuck like never before. The name Fractus, the uncertainty, the fact that he advertised in the famous science paper, he was showing that the length of the coast of England is infinite meters if you measure it as you have done in the past, and it explained why geographers in the 19th century or even earlier knew that the length of that was done between the boundary between Germany and Poland in particular, was La Vistola, it was the river in there, were measured by the two academies independently. And the difference was about 100 kilometers in the estimate. Why? Because they measured on maps of different scale. Because what happens is that if you make a more detailed, of course the Germans would have a super detailed map and they could measure those things. And the message is that we discover 3,000 years after Euclid that we have looked at nature with wrong eyes. Examples are so many, in fact. Fractals are there to remain, and fractals is something which is a byproduct of critical self-organization, which you can see it in a cabbage, certain cabbage, but this scale invariance has to be taken with salt, and the physicists have sorted out very well. That means that if you look at the coast of England, I mean, if you go down to the atomic scale, there should be a limit of that. Indeed, there is an upper cutoff and a lower cutoff, but you have phenomena that show scale invariance, that is, the part and the whole are similar statistically over a huge amount of scales. So, and there's it's now a mainstream. In fact, it's a mainstream result.
Right. This is, I'm afraid, all we have time for, but can I just suggest again Andrea's book. Thank you for taking the time, and thank you all for listening. Have a good evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sei